Written's on Bengal, personality study. And this is where I do all your work for you. And
thank you.
Make a fact sheet so you don't have to do that. I should make them ahead of time and then demand that you have done your own personality study so that
it's the astrological cat.
It'd be for class then. Now, this is our last class of the astrology on Thursday night until the first Thursday of February.
So the first Thursday of February.
And the second Thursday of February, the Shakespeare will meet, and we will meet with the Shakespeare next time. All right, these are pictures, all kinds of pictures of Van Gogh. The two that are photographs are most important because they show him with the more rounded features of Cancer rising, especially that bulbous nose. He apparently didn't like it because the most clear-cut pictures of him, he makes his nose straight and almost pointed. And that may be because when he was most alert, he was probably starving because he didn't have much to live by.
Is that why we cut off his ear instead?
No,
Which ones are photos?
The two on the right, in the ovals.
With the ear.
With the
ear. He cut off the ear very late in life. It's mentioned in the handout one.
That was over a woman, wasn't it?
Well, it was over sex anyway. A prostitute laughed at him and said she wouldn't sleep with him unless he gave her his ear. And she was joking, and he went home and got his ear off. And she freaked out. He freaked out. All right.
So maybe she meant
Ellen made it.
She wanted her to listen to him. I mean, she wanted him to listen to her. Is that what she meant? She wanted his ear?
No.
She was just being sarcastic. Yeah.
She was just being sarcastic. I wouldn't sleep with you unless you cut your ear off and gave it to me or something like that.
Is that a real man?
What?
Is that a real?
He was weird. He was very hard to take. No, couldn't be. Yeah, Ellen.
I'm just kidding.
There are a couple of things. All right. I think we're ready to go. Each time that we're looking at a personality, we're trying to do it in a slightly different way. And by doing that, we can learn different ways of getting out a chart or looking at things in a chart. You want to know as many ways of working into a chart as you can because some charts one thing may not work and you want to go to something else. The more ways that you're familiar with, the less likely you are to be stumped. And you're going to get stumped once in a while. I still get stumped after 40 years of studying astrology. Moreover, it's mind-opening and it's demanding to try to do things a different way each time. So this time, let's try to do something like a historical approach to his personality. The ascendant and the first house represent very early life as well as outer personality. There is a connection between very early life and personality because almost every psychological school believes that the personality is determined in the early days of your life. Both Freud and Jung, even though they didn't agree with each other on a lot of things, both felt that the personality was pretty much determined by age 3 to 3.5. They concluded this from analysis of patients who had problems and tracing those problems back to things early in life. mystics, or at least some mystics, have very different ideas about it. They feel that personality, like every other part of character, is developed over many rebirths. Physical personality is probably the oldest part of us. We've been through many reincarnations, and more of them have been in the realm of learning form than, for example, learning life or learning emotion or something like that. Rudolf Steiner has some very interesting ideas that are worth listening to anyway. He stated that it's a truth that in the inner vehicles, because they're so fluent and they're so readily changeable compared to the physical body, that something could be carried from the spirit into the new bodies directly, very easily. But it's difficult to carry something into the physical events, into the physical body. So what Steiner thought was that the events that happen in the first years of life, the childhood events, when they happen in the physical body, form the personality in such a way that past life events can be carried out. So like the early experiences actually get built right into the body. It's something like the Rolfers believe that the shape of your body is determined in early childhood, and that by reshaping it, by breaking down connective tissue and allowing it to reheal in a different way, you'll have a healthier body and a healthier personality. I think that's a backward way to go about it. I think if you turn a character, the physical personality will follow, but that's neither here nor there. So he thought that in the first 6 or 7 years, but especially again the first 3.5 years, that past life events were built into our bodies, and they took the shape that they did so that we could carry out the past lives. Let's go back and look at Vincent. I'm going to try and keep this real short. I don't think we'll get it under an hour, but I think we'll get it under 90 minutes. It's Christmas, and nobody wants to be out on a cold night for long. Vincent, as a child, was not a strong child. He wasn't an invalid, but he wasn't strong. That's exactly what we would expect with Cancer rising, because Cancer is a weak sign. We've been looking at Scorpio rising and Aries rising for a while now, and we've been seeing how strong they are. This is a big difference. Cancer rising not only is not a strong sign, but it often means somebody who's very introverted personally, sometimes even backwards. As you can see from all the pictures, Vincent was homely. And moreover, with Cancer rising, he was true to something of the sign Cancer in that he was a mama's boy. This is part of the problem of his life. She loved him, and even though she ultimately agreed with his father, she shielded him from his father. There were a lot of struggles, especially as he came into adolescence, between Vincent and his father. So Vincent had very much of an Oedipal childhood. He fought with his father, and his mother was the one in between that was loved of both of them. The tendency to fight emerged from a much deeper part of his character, but the personality was timid and retiring. You can see that the sun and moon, as we looked at when we were doing those profile analysis, the sun and moon are both fiery. So inwardly, there's a very strong tendency to be putting energy out, but it gets held back by the personality. One of the effects of his personality was that he was fretful. He was always trying to mother things and, fixing things up. He wasn't bold or challenging, which his inner character would have liked. So we see somebody that there is a fire seething beneath the surface, and on the surface all he can do is be emotional and feeling full, and in some ways probably feeling hurt.
You see that intensity in his eyes.
Yes. And probably one of the ways that it worked out, we'll come to that more with the emotionality, cancer arising, is after having this happen to him all of his life, he tended to be somewhat masochistic. And he put himself into situations where he would be harmed or not, the best would come out of him. Eventually, when he trained and channeled his outbursts of energy from within, he could, his expressions of energy from within were very sublime, but from early on, in the early childhood and in the personality, it was very, very difficult. There were times in his life when things boiled over, and they were difficult. Now, this chart is different from almost any chart that you'll run into in the United States. Usually in the Western world, the opportunities to interact with the father are indicated by the fourth house. Normally, it would naturally be in the 10th house, but in the Western world, it tends to be the fourth house. Apparently, Dutch society and the Dutch Reformed religion under which he was born, I believe his father was a minister, were traditional enough so that in Vincent's chart, the relationship with his father is much more indicated by the 10th house than by the 4th house. In the 10th house, it's fiery, active fiery, Aries fiery. So, even the Mars in the 10th house is turbulent and steamy and everything else. Now, in his youth, two topics seem to dominate. We're only going to cover one because that's all we really have time for. One was the prospect of marriage and a life with a wife, and the other was profession. We're going to look only at profession because it gets at the things that we want to get at. Vincent was very much of a misfit because of all of this. You can sense danger even though somebody seems really meek on the outside. This is somebody that's got tremendous intensity, despite the tendency. So it was difficult for him to fit into the world. He had two misfires in life as in trying to find a way to make a living before he became an artist. One of them is very important. We'll just mention it's the second one that is the most important, and we'll talk about the first one a little bit later on. He was very religious. His father was a minister, and he even studied in a theology school. He was not a good student. It's not because he was incapable, and it's not because he didn't care about theology. He was very interested in religion, but religion was something other than pure, abstracted, and set-aside theology. The moon, which is the ruler of the ascendant, and has a lot to say in the personality, is in Sagittarius. That's a fiery sign, and it's a fiery sign that is very much inclined toward religion. The strongest aspect that the moon makes is the conjunction with Jupiter, which is also in Sagittarius, and which is a very strong ruler of the horoscope. And it's a planet that's also very much disposed toward religion. So it's pretty easy to see that there's a strong religious bent to his character. But you can't see right away why he wasn't directed toward theology. Because Jupiter's strongest aspect is the trine to Mercury, and that would certainly show the ability and the aptitude and the interest for theology. If the moon and Jupiter had been in Pisces, the other Jupiterian sign, he probably would have been something like a feelingful prayer mystic, something of that nature. But with Cancer arising, a nature pantheism is another real possibility. In Sagittarius, it's much more likely that a nature pantheism is true to him more than anything else. But why he really didn't like theology is to be found somewhere else. Now, some of you have gone through 4 years of classes before getting to this level of course, and you have repeatedly heard that the aspects are stronger than the planets, and the planets are stronger than the houses, and the houses are stronger or more important than the signs. And when we look at this horoscope, it is an indication of that statement. The houses are more important than the signs. The house position of Jupiter and the moon is more important than the sign position. The sign position isn't without influence, because we certainly do find those things there, but the house position is what counts. The 6th house is a house of service. So it is a house of active participation, praxis, as it would be said in the classical sense of it. And that describes his early religious inclination. He had something where he was like a trial parson. It was not an internship, because he was pretty much more or less on his own. And where he did this was in a region of Holland called the Boranage, which was the coal mining area. The people were there were very poor people, and they were impoverished. There was a lot of tuberculosis, and they lived in really humble circumstances. But in all of their humility, they were outdone by their student pastor. He saw the side of Christ as a servant, and he did his utmost to live that side out. So we can see it's a personality strongly inclined towards 6th house service. He was bent on ministering to his parishioners. The influence of Sagittarius and Jupiter is exaggeration. In this, he was exaggerated. He visited their homes, he tended to the sick, he preached. When he preached, it was it was definitely not the kind of thing that was theological preaching. He tried to bring the religion of the ministering Christ and the love of suffering people into their lives. He was so exaggerated and he was so intense in this and he overwhelmed most of them. And they were afraid of him and amazed at him because he was kind of strange, he was intensely strange.
Is that because of the conjunction of the moon and Jupiter?
Yes, well, it's just the whole chart is a very intense kind of thing.
Because, Jupiter in Sagittarius would be a reasonably good place for Jupiter.
Yeah, conjoin the moon and square to Mars
I don't
and
mean
square to Venus. And,
I meant just in itself.
yeah.
Okay, conjoin. Okay.
The parishioners probably would have preferred a more normal minister. Someone maybe just a little above their station and maybe a little aloof. That way they would at least have something to look up to. Vincent's idea was very different from that. He saw Christ as having such appeal because Christ was someone that was more humble than everyone else. And that he was appealing because non-threatening and accessible. All of those things fit very well with Cancer rising and the moon and Jupiter in Sagittarius.
Not to mention all the Pisces.
Yeah. But that's not directly the personality. Now this is fine, but Vincent's humility wasn't an impersonal humility like that of Christ. It was a personal humility. And because he was so deliberately doing this, he was genuine and sincere, but it was too deliberate, and he overdid everything. The Moon-Jupiter conjunction is the pivot of an aspect pattern, which we're going to return to a number of times. We're only going to look at parts of it this evening. And that pattern includes both planets being trine to Mercury, and within that trine, both planets are squared to Venus and Mars. Now, the trines of the Moon and Jupiter to Mercury are stronger than the squares to Mars and Venus. But they're pretty close. None of the aspects is outstandingly stronger than any of the others. And there are twice as many squares as there are trines, and so they prevail in the character. So you can see that the personality is more troubled than it is redeemed. Moreover, the moon that is ruler of the ascendant, Mars and Jupiter, all three are stronger than Mercury. And they're more likely to be appealed to overall than Mercury. So it's obvious from his life and his work that he's more of a feeler than he is a thinker. Okay?
I don't see that the moon is squared to Venus.
It's close enough.
In this case?
By overlapping, yeah.
Okay.
Because of the cluster?
Yeah. The effect is there. All right, we won't do much with that aspect. Let's look at a little of this whole pattern business and see how it relates to his life circumstance. Because it's a pattern that is repeated many, many times in his life, but none so clearly as the way it relates to the personality. He tried very hard to become self-consciously, enthusiastically humble. The square, any square often means a building or construction process. So he was trying to build pride within humility, and he was trying to build a gentle religious zeal. Can I drop something here? Yeah.
shorten the night.
Huh?
That shorten the
That'll
night.
shorten the night. Before we can do that, we have to look at aspect moon. Join Jupiter. Moon is the number 3 planet at 156. Conjunction is the number 4 aspect at 49. 13%. 11%. Jupiter is the number 1 planet at 279. 24%. Well, and add it, let's put up the other one that we're going to look at tonight. Mars, square, Jupiter. Number 2, number 3, number 1. So it is a strong moon, a moderately strong aspect, and a very strong Jupiter. If you put together all of the keywords, and by now you must have hundreds of keywords, of the combinations of the keywords for the moon and Jupiter, one stands out when you look at the character of Van Gogh over all of the others. Take the keyword emotional for the moon and excess for Jupiter. And then you have somebody who is emotionally excessive. Jupiter is a lot stronger than the moon. So the excess is more than just emotionality. If the moon were much stronger, it would be a drawing or even a choking emotionality. And if they were both about the same strength, they would build on each other. Now there are a couple of peculiarities to look at in all of this. The moon is something like Mercury in that the flavor of its character is usually not very strong. Sometimes the moon almost seems to have a character that's all of its own only around full moon. Like Mercury, it is often neutral. And being neutral, it lends its strength to the planet that it aspects, and it magnifies that planet rather than detracting from it by having too much of its own character. So what we're looking at here is something like having a big Jupiter and a little Jupiter, and the moon being the little Jupiter. In this case, the moon lends itself more to the Jupiter than to any of the other planets in the whole aspect pattern because it's closer to Jupiter than any of the other aspects. Conjunction itself is prone to this kind of magnification more than any of the other aspects. And again, since the conjunction is more influenced by the squares than by the trines, we have to look at the trouble keywords more than we look at the benefic keywords. The unpleasant keywords associated with Jupiter that seem most appropriate to emotional excess are something like carelessness or a floppy kind of placidity. So he's emotionally excessive and carelessly so. In fact, it got so bad that when he lived in the Borean Age, He was completely careless about his attire. He was unclean. He didn't clean himself at all. And the way he lived, his living circumstances, his personal environment were similar. Unheated, unclean, uncared for. He looked so slovenly that nobody would ever have guessed that he was a minister. He just worked himself more and more into that kind of state. So his first house appearances were not very impressive. The other thing that is peculiar in this combination has to do with the fiery common sign nature of Sagittarius and Jupiter, and even the common water of Pisces. Both Sagittarius and Pisces are Jupiterian signs. So they're both exaggerative and expansive, but they're also something more. The expansive blending of fire and water, which is found in a number of ways beyond the conjunction, is redundantly repeated throughout the whole pattern. And that means there's something about this pattern that is evaporative, or it turns everything into a mist or into a vapor. So the expansive blending of fire and water is spreading one out. So with continued excess and continuous abandonment, you might say, or carelessness, that's raised to another level. It's almost like it becomes a vaporous kind of thing to him. Not to say that he was completely vapid, but in that direction. It's just enough to say for right now that the emotions and his whole personality got thinned out. He spread himself too thin. Since the moon represents the ascendant, it means that the personal physical body and the vitality gets spread thin and it gets exhausted. Sagittarius is not a strong sign in terms of sustained energy. Pisces is not a strong sign in terms of sustained energy, and the moon is not strong. So he exhausted himself through excess, through this emotional zeal that he had to be a humble servant, to the degree of collapse. Collapse is the kind of thing that happens with common signs. Whether it's kind of degenerate that ends up in the gutter or something like that, that's the way collapse works. We don't have time to look at all of the aspects, but let's look at the Mars-Jupiter, because it's an interesting aspect also. In this case, there is a strong Mars, the number 2 planet, and the square is very strong, but the Jupiter is extremely strong. And so even though Mars is only 3/4 of the strength of Jupiter, it's not highly imbalanced, or it's not a specialized aspect. Now, there are a lot of things that this aspect can and did mean, but there is one thing that the 2 planets share in common that is certainly a matter in his life, and that is pride. Vincent was enormously proud. Since Jupiter is stronger, it's not likely to be a muscular pride, or more like a pride in his goodness. The Sun in Aries would much rather have something more robust, but it was more like a relaxed pride. So what we have is something of like a philosophical or a religious pride. But this is not as Sagittarius normally is, which would be pompous and getting into all kinds of rites and ceremonials. The 6th house business comes out, and it is a pride in being able to serve. So you can see that there's an internal conflict between pride and humility in the very thing he's trying to do. The struggle just goes on throughout the whole pattern. The meekness of Cancer is not keen on cruelty that is normally associated with pride, and it affects the Jupiterian nature enough so that there isn't a care for pageantry or pomp or any of those kinds of things. The way it does work out is as a buoyant kind of enthusiasm and kind of zeal. So the religious pride that he has, he gets uplifted and he gets energized and he becomes zealous. This is the aspect through which, or that symbolizes the intensity that came through his personality. It's inclined towards something lofty, but it's still intense enough to frighten other people off. And again, it is a pattern that has internal contradiction. How can you be proud and humble at the same time? Incomplete, it's not possible at all. You just can't be that way. The two are mutually exclusive. However, you can try. I have had periods in time when I have had great humility. And I had been before the Spirit. But I wasn't always in those states, and when I wasn't, I was proud of the fact that I was humble. And something like that is what was going on. Vincent may have been carried away enough to think that his pride was something like a righteous dignity, and that he really was humble all of the time, if he cared at all about it.
Richard,
Yes.
I don't know if I totally caught where you got the humbleness from. The Cancer rising in the sixth house.
Yep. And the moon Jupiter puts itself into a humble kind of position.
Because it's in the sixth?
What?
Because it's in the sixth house?
Yes. We said that this is where we went with the house being stronger than the sign.
Okay.
Because to be a servant, you're automatically putting yourself in a menial position, and you're doing it for very lofty reasons, but the service dominates, and to him this meant that you had to put yourself in a lowly place. And there was some certain amount of nullification that takes place with that, which is all right. All right, so he's trying to be self-consciously humble, and he certainly is enthusiastically working at it. Now, the square often represents building, construction. Everything in the cosmos is built by the right angle principle. So you can see that there are two things that are squared off with each other, and they're making a building block. So he's trying to build a pride within humility. He's trying to take the two opposites, and he's trying to produce a gentle zeal. Because there was internal friction, this meant the friction of constantly trying to keep the two together in a way that they didn't want to be together was also tiring. Just to maintain that kind of zeal in your desire nature has to wear off the vitality. That didn't mean that he ever quit trying, because he never did. And he even tried harder and harder and harder. The more that he was likely to fail, the more desperate he was. You don't know whether for sure whether that was humility or whether that was part of the pride. I'm not going to give in to this, and I'll be overcome in the struggle. It's not difficult to imagine with practitioners parishioners must have felt in their discomfort. You know, this is a kind of a weird, intense guy.
Yeah.
People who try really, really, really hard, and it's necessary at a certain point of spiritual growing, are uncomfortable to be around.
Interesting to see his chart compared to Rasputin's.
I thought that Rasputin had a chart.
That figures.
And I don't mean that in a negative sense. Rasputin may have been a very, very holy man, getting pretense of a certain kind in order to accomplish even more. Because there aren't many people that you can feed poison to and it doesn't get to them, and if you shoot them and they can pick themselves up out of the pile.
You can drown them.
Yes. And he disappeared basically. They don't know whether he really was done in or not. So you can be so intense that you're hard to be around. So even though the moon is shy and it wants to deal with people intimately, it must be hard being intimate and close with him. Here he comes to visit us again. Maybe we turn the lights off and lock the doors and hide, and he'll go away. And he would go to people's houses and talk to them about Christ and get them all to try to live the same kind of enthusiastic life.
Probably exhausted their vital energy too.
Yes. So it's not hard to see how he spent himself. And he worked himself into such a state because he almost starved himself. He had nothing coming in, and he didn't want to receive a lot of things from people he was trying to serve. And eventually his family had to come to him because he just was incapacitated. Needless to say, he flunked out of the theology college, the divinity school, because he wouldn't study the theology. He didn't care about it. He thought it was irrelevant. And he's probably right. Now it's interesting in that his philosophical and theological issues are raised all the time in his letters to his brother, but it was not in an academic setting. And he had a similar view with regard to art. He didn't like the history of art, and he didn't like specific schools of art. He liked many painters. He liked Millet, for one. He liked Goya. He liked the light and the color of Impressionism, but he never really studied it as a school of art. So the ascendant looms very large in this, with one word, naturally. If theological issues or philosophical issues can be expressed naturally, or if there are problems in art that are naturally part of the situation, that's fine. Everything had to issue naturally from life. If they were set apart in their own realm, he wouldn't care for them at all. Art had to spring out of life, and it had to come out of the artist naturally, or it wasn't real for him. He didn't make a big deal about other things being unreal. He just wasn't interested in them, and he just didn't give himself to it. He just went off and did his own thing. And it wasn't that he didn't always try. At one point, he was very impressed and worked together with Gauguin, and there's some likelihood that he was even in love with Gauguin. Whether it would have gotten to the level of homosexuality or not, it will be something that we'll try to look at another time. But Gauguin looked down on him as being an uneducated primitive. Now, Van Gogh had such a high regard for Gauguin that he tried to learn art in that artificial sense, because Gauguin influenced him so much, but his art from that period is terrible. It suffers. It's about 2 years ago that they had an art show in Chicago called Van Gogh and Gauguin in the Studio of the South. And if you look in that period, Van Gogh's art is very bad. On the other hand, his influence on Gauguin was positive, and it was good for Gauguin, but not for him. It was at this period that he started to again become reckless and careless and manifest an artistic zeal which hadn't been with him since the time at the Voronezh. In fact, it eventually became more intense than it was at the Voronezh. Cancer rising, his personality was tuned to nature. How much so is you really don't know. Nature for him, he transcended Sagittarius position of the moon and Jupiter, but it wasn't a it was like Platonism or something like that that was removed. The transcendence was right within nature. And life couldn't be separated from them. Now before he was a minister for a while, he tried to be a school teacher for a very brief period. And for a while, he was just had a short time. He did well at it because he liked fostering younger people, even though he was very young himself. And for a while, he was an art dealer in the same concern, the same art company that his brother was an art dealer in. At first, he succeeded when he was in London because he liked London, he liked the literature, and he liked the galleries in London. But when he was transferred to Paris, his interest waned. He liked art, but he got sick and tired of selling it. And he did not realize it at that time. He didn't realize it until the end of his stay at the Voronezh that he really wanted to do art and not just sell it. With his shy temperament, he was not really good at sales, and things almost had to sell themselves. In his informality, he didn't fit well in formal work of, wearing a suit and tie, having see people come and buy paintings. It was harmonious for him because he liked being around a world of pictures. He did this all the time. Where he lived, he constantly surrounded himself with pictures. Prints from other artists, some of his own drawings, things like that. He always surrounded himself. This is Cancer rising. It's an environment that is influenced by pictures. Because pictures have a setting. And there's something, a whole, a total about a picture. We'll come to that in a little bit. At the end of his stay at the Voronezh, one of the few things that kept him sane was the fact that he started to draw. And when he was recovering himself, he made an arrangement with his brother Theo that his brother would support him until he could get on his feet as an artist. His brother ended up supporting him for the rest of his life. And he was always begging his brother for money. And the letters that he writes are beautiful, but there's always appeals for money. I need this kind of paint or something like that. He actually supported a mistress with his brother supporting him. And it wasn't really a mistress like you think in a fashionable salon sense. But when his brother started having children and the expenses of life started to tally up, there was some friction in the family. She got all his sister-in-law, because both of the boys died pretty early. Sister-in-law got many millions of dollars worth of paintings later on. And she was in a fix, too, because she had to turn them into a museum. She couldn't just sell them off because they were considered a Now, there are a lot of interesting questions about his character, and there's one that pertains to the personality sort of indirectly that we want to look in, and that is, why did his character change, and how much did it change when he became an artist? Why did his character change when he became an artist instead of a minister? You could say, well, maybe his calling was to be an artist more than it was to be a minister, but that doesn't do much. Well, now you study astrology, and things like that. We're a little bit out of the direct topic, but because it's an important principle, if you're going to be an applied astrologer trying to help people, I want to look at it. And I want to look at character as a whole. And when you look at character as a whole, even though we're departmentalizing things into a personality and emotionality, a mentality and a spirituality, character isn't solid, and it doesn't have boundaries like cusps, such like that. So we're not really out of line. We've noted sufficiently already that he had a troubled personality and that the personality wasn't his strong suit. We look for a second at the 10th house. The 10th house is the house of professions. Now, some of the planets in the 10th house are in troublesome aspects with the planets in the 6th, but not all of them. Mercury forms good aspects with the planets in the 6th. The Sun is unaspected, and Jupiter, which rules the 10th, forms positive aspects with the planets in the 11th. So there are more good opportunities to do things well and to do them in a controllable way in the 10th house than there are in the 6th house. So as he became an artist, he viewed himself very differently. At least for a long time in his career, he viewed himself differently. He saw himself as a professional, someone with a significant place in the world. He didn't see himself as a servant. The 6th house is more generally troubled than the 10th house. So when he put himself in the 10th house, he saw himself in that light.
And what put him in the 10th house?
His consciousness. When he became an artist, he thought of himself, just like when he became a minister, he thought himself as a ministering individual. And that immediately put his consciousness in the 6th house. When he saw himself as an artist, he saw himself as a professional. It's mentioned in his letters all the time. He was conscious of himself as someone who influenced the world as a professional. And so when he had his consciousness in that, he was more the positive aspects come out. And it's a matter of choice. It's a matter of free will. And that's the whole principle that we're trying to get at.
Is that a moon sun kind of?
No, I think it's just the 10th house. It's just a choice of where you want to put your attention. The Sun is in the 10th house, and self-image as a professional is part of it. But Mars conjoined Venus, conjoined the midheaven like that, is certainly a sign of someone that is an artistic professional. And because he chose to do that, immediately his life cleared up. It doesn't mean that he was in trouble, but he chose the path that was less troublesome for himself.
So what you're saying is that the 10th house opportunities and the 6th house opportunities, once the opportunities to become an artist presented himself in the 10th house, or that because it was an artist, that is what changed his consciousness. You're not saying that there was an astrological event that changed. It was
No.
just the
There
opportunities.
may have been
always
an astrological event. I haven't looked that over.
You're talking
But
about
just choosing to be an artist rather than choosing to be a ministerial servant, by that choice, he put himself into the part of his character that was much more positive, into opportunities that gave him a better image of himself. That's important.
Creation and change on
Yeah.
reality.
And that's because you said there's more positive aspects with the 10th house planets than with the 6th house.
Yes. In general, the same aspect pattern of Jupiter and the Moon is there with Mars, Venus, and Mercury, but there is the Sun that is there, and there are the Neptune aspects, and so there are more things that are positive there. I don't know. I don't know. But it's just important to know this, because if somebody gets themselves stuck in one place, that if you can get them to focus their attention into a different house, you can help them remedy their life a great deal. It's a different kind of activity that's in a different house. Yes. And when he did this, he had goals. He had goals like he felt it was necessary for somebody to paint starry nights. And nobody had ever done that, and eventually he realized that nobody but him was ever going to do that. But this is almost an impossible task. If you think, how are you going to get across the idea of what a starlight at night is like? You'd have to paint the whole canvas dark near black and just have little spots in there. He didn't do that, but he had a goal, and before he actually made that in his artwork, he had that in his mind for years before he did it. So the goals themselves, not only the dignity that he had in seeing himself as a professional, but the goals of the things that he wanted to do for the world, and what he thought he had to offer the world as a colorist, all of those kinds of things are extremely important. Do you have a question? Okay.
How important is the strength of the house in terms of what somebody does in their life? I mean, like different houses have, what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's going further with the estimation system that I want to go right now. That's what comes up in the next course on. It's a house-by-house analysis of house quotients and departmental quotients, things like that. And I think first that we want to get thoroughly imbued with this for the next 4 or 5 years, and then after.
Well, just real simply though, is a house that's a lot stronger than all the other houses of
Yes.
great significance?
Yes.
Okay.
You have to be careful though that you don't overlap when you make house quotients. We'll get to that. But in a few years.
45 minutes.
We're talking about that goal. We thought about painting a star night for a few years.
But it may be too late for us to change our lives by then.
Well, you got enough of a rough idea. So this is something really important. Somebody can change their life, and they can change what part of their being they focus on and how they think about themselves or how they feel about themselves by focusing on one house rather than another. You don't even have to talk houses. You can say, well, if you did this, or if you made this important in your life, I think you'd feel better about yourself. That's a really thing. Eventually, the squares and such did prevail in his chart, and he went back to exhaustion, and he had to be put in the cemetery and things like that before he eventually killed himself. But it was a long time before that set in, and it's because he had to respect the 10th house. A lot of this is covered in the written thing that we're talking about that's there. Now, there's one thing about his personality that we have not covered, but which the world certainly sees as important. We've just seen now that a horoscope and character are not rigid. It's not something that's black and white. It's fluid. Things flow into each other. that doesn't mean that there aren't internal tensions and internal lines of tension, so to speak, even in a fluid character. Now, we've looked at the moon in Cancer in association with Jupiter and Sagittarius, and we see how that resulted in excess and in turbulence and exhaustion, all through carelessness, getting carried away by things. Now, that doesn't mean that those are the only ways that this worked in his life. There is a fire-water struggle that's shown in many ways. And that, the moon's part of that, wants everything to be natural. Jupiter, which is the strongest planet by quite a bit, is an abstract planet. And it's in an abstract sign. The Impressionists and Van Gogh, who was not considered an Impressionist, but he is considered an abstract expressionist, opened the whole door to modern abstract art. However, Van Gogh, not because of his time in history, but because of his character, could not be a pure abstract artist. The lunar part of his nature wouldn't allow it. Wouldn't say it could be that. The moon in Cancer had to have something representational. A picture, an image, a setting, a person. It had to be something representational. If you look at his portraits, his self-portraits, they're not really detailed. So it isn't overall representational, it's something representational. Jupiter demanded abstraction. So there's something of a tension between the two.
Although looking at his chart, you could see very easily how he might see the sky that way as a reality.
Yeah. That you get a better answer to that in the
year 2075.
Yeah. It's very hard. I'm trying to do something a little bit different in the written than I'm doing here, but the two do work together, and you get a reasonable understanding by working together. The kind of abstraction that he did was an abstraction to light and especially color. In abstraction, pure abstraction, things would be simplified to pure color. In pure Cancerian quality, things would be like photographs, and there would be no abstraction. The abstraction of Jupiter and Sagittarius can't stand detail. So there's always a struggle, and there's always a tension between them, and there's always a compromise. So, the Sagittarian qualities, his pictures are idealistic. A Sagittarian idealism. It's not churchy. It is an idealism of a world where everything is bright in light and bright in color.
And
Yes. In the early ages, the early part of his art, when he was still influenced by the Voronage, he drew poor people who were dirty and the light was dark and things like that. But the more he came into himself as a professional, the more it was an idealism of light and color. And it was a world that was idealistic, in which he edified simple, everyday people, but without bothersome detail. So it's a world in which light and color dominate. So this kind of abstraction pervades his personality. He loves nature and intimate settings and common people. He accepts them, but he doesn't pay attention to all the little details. He does not believe in trying to discipline natural function.
Are we going to touch on any of the Taurus in his chart tonight?
Any what?
Any of the Taurus in his chart
No.
tonight?
We're hardly going to do much of anything with that.
Okay.
It's not very. It's the three weakest planets are planets in Mars. So he has the Moon square Mars, which we will look at in depth when we cover the emotionality, which, as we remember from last time, the Isadora Duncan, she had the Moon trine Mars. She thought this should be a fluent expression of desire. It's only natural that we copulate on this hardwood floor after knowing each other an hour. It's not good to fight nature. In his case, it's not only that, but it's unrestrained. It's just like a careless thing. But he idealistically drew women. For example, he understood it all. There was a time that he had been working by himself alone, painting by himself alone, and drawing by himself alone for, I think, a number of years. And then he went into an art school for a while, just because he could get models there. And sometimes when he was painting so fast and furious that the paint was dripping off of the easel and everything else, and they were all astounded by it. And they had this svelte little model, and he was drawing her with big hips. And the teacher came over and said, "She doesn't have big hips." He says, "A woman's got to have big hips to bear a child." So he had
only natural.
He had a natural. You got it. It's a natural function, and he idealized. And he didn't idealize it according to some personal aesthetic. It always had to be according to nature. Yeah, it's really interesting. So that's just one example of the kind of tension between nature and idealism, and it just goes back and forth in his consciousness like that all the time. While he let natural things be, even his personal habits, he just let go of them. His mind was always on abstract things. So even though he was careless, and I don't think he ever dressed, once he left the art world as an art dealer, I don't think he ever dressed right for the world ever after that. He just didn't care. But especially more as he got into art, he was always had the idea in his mind of what he was trying to do. He intimates this in his letters. I would really, if any of you wants to read it, I have a book of his letters to his brother Theo. It's a wonderful read because he's a great writer. You want to borrow?
Oh, I was just, Dear Theo.
Well, there are various versions of it, yeah. I think mine's called Dear Theo. But he says this all the time in his letters, or he doesn't say it. You can see his mind is on abstract ideas. So his art is idealized in abstractions, but they are not abstractions from nature, but abstractions within nature. So you can see it's a really very fruitful tension between abstract and natural things. That's all.
Now, I got a question for you to digress. Do you have this chart in front of you?
Yep.
Okay. If you were to take all planets and move them counterclockwise, one house each, placing, for example, Moon and Jupiter in the 7th house, what kind of excesses would we tend to see there, if you can?
I think that if you did that, the way the oblique ascension goes, the Mars and Venus would still be in the 10th house because things start catching up. The Moon and Jupiter, that would more likely be Gemini rising, and it would probably be something, a horoscope of social scandal, and somebody that was very good at relationships from having to be good at relationships to keep from getting into and out of scandalous situations.
Would it, in that though, would that allow greater abstraction because you would no longer have Cancer rising?
I don't know. I'd have to sit down and think about the chart. It would be a different character, yes. It wouldn't have that same natural element to it.
Is the Cancer ascendant and having the moon rule it similar to like just having the moon in Cancer in the chart?
No, that's not. It carries through, but the moon is in a fiery sign and it's not comfortable there. And if the moon were in Cancer, it would it would be so maternal. He'd maybe be something like a biologist or a chef or something like that. That he would be nurturing things, and it wouldn't be abstract, and it wouldn't even be that much involved in service or anything like that.
Abstraction comes mainly from what, in general?
Jupiter.
Always Jupiter?
Sagittarius. Yes.
Okay.
Those are very strongly abstracted.
Would that being a bucket, would that having to do with he may use his career or work with the 10th house?
No, I think everything hinges on abstraction. But if you stay with the hinge, you get stuck in the activity, because it's the sixth house. The sixth house is one of those things where you get stuck in the busy work. But to a certain extent, his ability to solve the problem of abstracting from nature, all of his artistic career does hinge on that. So the ability to take nature and abstract it in a way that he feels comfortable, and to do those impossible things with the squares of Mars and Venus, like humility and pride at the same time. Try to do those things, everything hinges on that.
Back to this changing focus.
Yes.
When is that useful, and what would you look for? What area would you look for? What stands out as the next place to go for somebody? In other words, what's the best place to shift the focus to? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, since there are so many planets in the 10th house, if Vincent came into you as an astrologer and said, I'm having all these difficulties, there are so many planets there, and they're more positive that there is a realistic ability, you certainly, because the second house isn't a big house, it's a small house, and its ruler has no aspects at all, you certainly wouldn't recommend to this person, there's not much likelihood that he'd get into a positive state by being a securities investor or something like that. But there is a realistic possibility with the planets in the 10th house, and a realistic possibility that make things a little bit better. And in this case, it was a lot better. So you just have to look around. If somebody comes to you and they're having a hard time in doing what they're doing, and you can see that the focus is obviously in a place that's not good, what you have to do is try to find something for them to put their attention into, that they're going to see things differently, and that they're going to be in a much different setup with relation to life. It's a very important thing.
So you would look in the chart to see where the strongest clusters or aspects or what would swing it into a different area to begin with? In other words, why wouldn't there be a natural inclination to go there for the person themselves?
In this case, I think that this would have occurred in life anyway, because the earlier part of life is ruled by the ascendant, and the lunar focus, direct lunar focus, is in the sixth house. So he would be inclined for something like that early on. But as he worked into other things, as he matured in his emotions and he matured in his thinking, then his attention would automatically be drawn to those other planets.
So is that the rule of thumb, general case, that you start out with
the
yes, ascendant, and then it just starts diversifying into the stronger parts of your. Yeah. Okay.
The whole thing is, the whole tone of the light is set by the ascendant in the first house. That's it. Thank you guys very much.
Thank
Thank you.
Have good holidays.
Is this the last class?
No,
Oh, I think
it's the
so.
last astrology class. I won't see my.
Okay. Sorry.
That's all right.
Everything's about me.
Are you going away?
No. I was bleeding until just a little over a week ago. And it's not a good idea to go into the middle of nowhere in that way. So I'm studying Spanish like crazy now. I'm trying to learn at least a little bit.
He's going to learn the tango too before he goes.
Who's going to teach me?
We could take classes together.